So the Isaiah text is amazing today, and I'm just very blessed to be able to look at it. It has wonderful images and symbols. You've got the lamb, the wolf, the Garden of Eden up on the cosmic mountain, the peaceable kingdom. But you've also got the vipers, the asps, the snakes down in their pit of desolation and dereliction. So I just want to invite you into some of these symbols. I get to play Dan Brown a little bit, which I just kind of love. But some of these symbols, like the snakes and the lamb, and the Garden of Eden, the peaceable kingdom, they're so rich and so amazing for Advent season that it's worth playing into them a little bit. So let's put the lamb kind of at the intersection of the snakes and the garden, and we'll put the lamb here near the altar. There'll be a significance for for that happening. But can you all join me in just living into this? Bah, bah. All right, and then we've got the mountaintop experience on the mountain of the Lord. So I may be showing my age, but remember what happens when you bite into a York peppermint patty? You get the sensation. So, whoosh, whoosh, and then, of course, down here with the dean, we have the vipers and the asps and the pit of dereliction. So that would be hiss, hiss. Now, just for a moment, we need to sort of why in this beautiful poem about fellowship between wild animals do we have to have the serpents, the dragons, the chaos monsters here, down in the pit? Why is it necessary to think about the abyss? Because even as we celebrate Advent and look forward to the coming of the peaceable kingdom and the Lamb, we look around, we turn on the news, and we've got Gaza, we have got Ukraine, we've got Sudan. We're in the midst of this. And we could just be sad and try to live into Advent and enjoy the beauty and forget the pit of snakes and the chaos, but I think that would be to cheapen the message of the gospel. It's actually during these times of finding ourselves having to stare into the shadows, having to face into the wolves, that we can get into a deeper understanding of what Advent is about and what the gospel is about. So how does that work? Let me run you through some ideas. There's no one way that it works, but one thing I do know is that if you don't face down into the shadows, you will stagnate, you will not grow, you will not have a chance to get the sensation. So keep your eye on this sensation. So let's just look. I projected a little bit of an image created by artificial intelligence of verse 6. The NRSV over to the left of verse 6 is just talking about the wolf living with the lamb. But if just take a peek at the Hebrew, the translation on the right, the Catholic version, the New American Bible, gets it much better. The wolf will be the lamb's guest. That's a bit different. The wolf is invited into, the lamb invites the wolf into the lamb's own home, into the lamb's own presence, even though the wolf is carnivorous and dangerous and, quite frankly, quite scary. I think that's part of the gospel message, is that vulnerability to be eaten, hoping through nonviolent hospitality that the wolf would be much too embarrassed to eat his host, seeing as the host has exposed his soft underbelly and made the wolf welcome and made himself completely finite and frail. So I think that's part of why we need the descent into the shadows a little bit. That helps us to see our finitude, our vulnerability, our ability to lay ourselves open is part of who we are, but we so often buffer ourselves against that, right? We create all of these shields and buffers against our finitude and our mortality. But those buffers also keep us from being touched by God and by this greater vision, this really real reality at large that's there, but we can't see it. So part of what you sublate when you run down into the pit and confront this is that you can embrace that part of you that's willing to have this kenosis, to let go of all that buffering and shielding and go back to who you really are, and that can connect you with God. So that's one of the things that the snake pit in this text, I think, does. It's part of the symbol. So then the next question in the last 5 minutes is, well, that sounds very easy, but to enter into the snake pit, to actually be bitten, perhaps to die to your own self, where do you get the power for that? Who in the world is going to be able to give us the energy and the strength and the determination to make that journey, to face those shadows, to do that kenosis of emptying? It's not going to be easy, but if you read the larger context of the passage, we've got this model of vulnerability and frailty and mortality, and that's this shoot out of the branch of Jesse, and that's the one that we're waiting for at this time of Advent. And there's a number of things that are really very powerful about him. But one of the most powerful things is that he shows the way down into vulnerability. He is able to side with the weak and the afflicted and the poor, even though those are not the strengths, those are not the people to side with. If you're a good leader and you want your institution to move forward, you don't side with the poor and the marginalized. So he's frail. And this notion of being a shoot or a little branch or a sprig, that gets picked up and actually quoted in Isaiah 53. So when you move into the suffering servant songs of 2nd Isaiah, you've got this vision and its power really, really pushed out before you. And in that servant's vulnerability, in that servant's frailty and laying down of life, he opens up the reality of the peppermint patty moment. You can see the peppermint patty moment because he steps out of the way in his frailty and in his shrinking and in his pulling back of the ego through the power of what Blake called the marriage of heaven and hell. Don't just give up on the snake pit. Face into it, live into it, sublate it if you can. As I was thinking about the horrors of what we're going through right now with Gaza and with Sudan and with Ukraine, I was drawn to Viktor Frankl's meditations. He was a physician who spent time in, I think, 3 Nazi concentration camps. And it was there that he was right in the middle of this viper pit, this home of the adder. And yet it was there in the midst of this evil that's so dark that you're thrust into this realm of the transcendent, that he began to have the buffering. The snakes were biting away all of that buffered self that Charles Taylor talks about. And in the midst of that snake pit, he became more porous, as Charles Taylor talks about, more open, what we've lost in our secular modernity. He could see more of the transcendence, more of the peppermint patty moment. And maybe I'll close with that thought. Frankl perceived far more. So he was working they put him to work in a terrible situation in the Bavarian woods, even before dawn. But his work partner nudged him and said, I can just see the dawn and the colors. And all of a sudden he had this memory of a Dürer watercolor of the Bavarian woods. And it wasn't just natural beauty that struck him. When natural beauty shades into transcendence, it's the term that theologians use, that's the sublime. Augustine knew it, but many, many others as well. So it was these kenotic depletions, this time in the snake pit, that facilitated perception of the sublime. Now there's a theological paradox for you. And it's not just natural beauty that he saw, but amidst the Nazis, he saw not just physical fairness, but fairness in terms of God's justice amidst all the suffering, all the pain, all of the injustice. And it's that vision that we need right now during this Gaza conflict that's so horrific and so sad. So their minds expanded, opened by kenosis. Those in misery find God's fairness amid the unfairness of their immediate sublunary quotidian experience. And it may be at the bleakest experiences of life that divine illumination can shine into the darkness and expose its true impotency. I mean, if we weren't confronted with evil at its most horrific and violence at its most damaging, would we really appreciate the amazing grace and love of God? So in this manner, transcendent revelation may strike a totalizing blow, since the shadow of death and meaninglessness has swelled to its most formidable apex, rising to the neck. It is not coincidental then that Daniel received his apocalypses in the darkness of exile. Remember, Isaiah elsewhere in chapter 9 says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in a land of deep darkness, it is on them that the light has dawned. And eventually that root of Jesse that this passage talks about does have the power to help us all through this journey of kenosis. And in fact, if you look at the final verse that was read this morning, verse 11, verses 10, God sets this root of Jesse as a signal, a beacon, a model, an archetype for all the world, for all nations. And again, that's immediately quoted and picked up in 2nd Isaiah. After the exile has happened, the people are in darkness. That hope is projected hundreds of years and realized in Isaiah 49:22. So, don't let anyone ever tell you that the idea of a scion of Jesse, a Davidic Messiah, and frailty, suffering, and death is something that Jesus invented in the New Testament. You have heard it from Isaiah 11, and you've seen, because it's quoted so much later in the exile in Isaiah 49, that it's not just confined to Isaiah's immediate circumstance. There's a canonical shaping that pushes this vision forward to 2nd Isaiah and even beyond into our Advent as we await this signal to the nations, this coming light that will enlighten all peoples. Amen.